1. Comparing the somatic versus autonomic nervous system. So what exactly is the autonomic nervous system? Well, from previous discussions, we know that the peripheral nervous system has two parts. You have your autonomic nervous system and your somatic nervous system. Your somatic nervous system is for voluntary movements that allow you to run, dance, and exercise, as well as control skeletal muscles. Your autonomic nervous system controls involuntary movements for your heart, lungs, and GIT, as well as controls smooth muscles and glands. So how do these two systems differ structurally? For the somatic nervous system, it only takes one neuron to get from the CNS to the effector organ, which is usually a muscle, and they release acetylcholine. For the parasympathetic ANS, it takes two neurons to get to your effector organs. You have a long preganglionic neuron and a shorter postganglionic neuron. Where they meet is called your autonomic ganglia, and both of them release acetylcholine. For your sympathetic ANS, it takes two neurons to get to your effector organ. So you have a short preganglionic neuron that releases acetylcholine and a long postganglionic neuron that releases norepinephrine. Where the two meet is called your autonomic ganglia. Here's a table summarizing the differences between the somatic and autonomic nervous system. That's it for Lesson 1. Now it's time for Lesson 2. Divisions of the ANS. The ANS has two divisions. You have your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system. First, you have your sympathetic nervous system. It's known to have your thoracolumbar outflow from T1 to L3, and that's because the origins come from T1 to L3, which was responsible for the fight or flight response. As for the parasympathetic nervous system, it's known to have your craniosacral outflow containing the nucleus from cranial nerves 9, 10, 7, and 3, as well as those of S2 to S4. It's responsible for the rest and digest function of our body. What makes up the structure of the ANS? Well, here we have your preganglionic neuron, which is the origin of your ANS. You have your autonomic ganglia, where your two neurons meet. You have your postganglionic neuron, which sends to the effector organs. And lastly, you have your autonomic plexuses, which are branches. Let's talk about them individually, starting with your preganglionic neurons. For the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons originate from cranial nerves 9, 10, 7, and 3, as well as S2 to S4. For the sympathetic nervous system, it's from T1 to L2. Now let's talk about autonomic ganglia. Autonomic ganglia from the parasympathetic nervous system are called the terminal or intramural ganglia because they terminate near the effector organ. For the sympathetic nervous system, we have your paravertebral ganglia, which are found on the sides of your spinal cord. And then you have your prevertebral ganglia, which are found anterior to your spinal cord. So this is what they would look like. Para means side and pre means anterior. There are three ways in which the preganglionic neuron reaches your autonomic ganglia. Number 1 would be to exit with a spinal nerve of the same level. Number 2 would be to ascend one level above and exit with a spinal nerve there. And number 3 would be to descend one level below and exit with a spinal nerve found below. So they can synapse at the same level, a level above, or a level below. So dual innervation means that most organs supplied by the sympathetic nervous system are also supplied by the parasympathetic. Now let's talk about autonomic plexuses, which are mainly found in the abdomen and the pelvis. Autonomic plexuses are tangled networks of sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. There are 6 major plexuses in your ANS. You have your cardiac plexus, which innervates your heart, your pulmonary plexus, which innervates your bronchial tree, your celiac or solar plexus, which innervates your celiac artery and is the largest out of all of them. The superior and inferior mesenteric plexuses supply your GIT, and your renal plexus supplies your kidneys. Now for the specific structure of the sympathetic nervous system. For the sympathetic nervous system, they pass through the intermediate lateral gray horn, through the anterior root, and through the white rami communicantes. For the sympathetic ganglia, although they start from the cervical and end with the sacral, they only receive innervation from the thoracic and lumbar segments. For their postganglionic neuron, they can exit with the spinal nerve via the white rami communicans and the gray rami communicans. Aside from that, they can exit via the cephalic periarterial nerves. So these are nerves that wrap around arteries. Next, they can exit by the sympathetic nerves to the heart and lungs, so they ascend segments in order to innervate the heart and lungs. Lastly, you have your splanchnic nerves. So your splanchnic nerves are actually nerves that don't synapse and reach the effector directly. So more on specific structures later on. Now let's talk about specific structure of the parasympathetic nervous system. Presynaptic neurons exit cranially with the brainstem and with the cranial nerves. For the sacral segment, they exit with the lateral gray horn of S2 to S4, and they have 4 major ganglia. More details on this later on. Next, let's talk about your enteric nervous system. So this is responsible for the control of the GIT. You have your submucosal plexus, which is responsible for the secretion of glands, and you have your myenteric plexus, which is responsible for the contractions and peristalsis. And lastly, we have lesson 3, all about neurotransmitters and receptors. So first off, we have cholinergic neurons, and these are neurons that release acetylcholine. So you have your nicotinic nerve, which stimulates your nerve, your nicotinic muscle, which stimulates muscle, and you have your chromaffin cells from your adrenal medulla. You also have your muscarinic receptors and neurons. So muscarinic 1 stimulates brain and stomach, muscarinic 2 inhibits the heart, and muscarinic 3 is for the glands and smooth muscles. Next, we have adrenergic receptors and neurons. So these are the ones that release and receive norepinephrine or noradrenaline and adrenaline. So you have your alpha 1 for stimulation of glands, stomach, and urinary sphincters. And you have alpha 2, which is for inhibition of smooth muscles, platelets, and pancreas. So beta 1 stimulates your heart, your kidneys, and your adipose tissue, as well as your posterior pituitary gland. Beta 2 inhibits smooth muscles, your eye, and your liver, and beta 3 is for adipose, which is for thermoregulation. Next, let's talk about autonomic tone. So autonomic tone is actually the balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic responses. So there needs to be a balance between the two responses, and this is being regulated by the hypothalamus. Some parts of the body have no parasympathetic innervation, but a decrease in sympathetic action also has the same effect. Now let's talk about the physiology of the ANS. So let's start with the sympathetic responses. They are activated during emergency situations. So here are the responses. For the eyes, there is mydriasis or dilation of the pupil, the lens is flattened, and there is a decreased lacrimation or tearing up. For the salivary glands, there is decreased salivation and a more viscous and thick saliva is formed. For the heart, what is generally being acted on are the nodal cells, allowing for increased heart rate, as well as your myocardium increasing heart contractility, as well as vasoconstriction causing increased blood pressure. For the esophagus, so there is a decrease in peristalsis, allowing for slowing down of food passage to your GIT. For the lungs, there is bronchodilation and vasoconstriction of bronchial arteries, as well as a decrease in secretions. For the GIT itself, there is inhibition of peristalsis, decreased absorption, secretions, and as well as constriction of the pyloric sphincter. For the liver, you have glycogenolysis, which allows for more glucose to be used by the body, as well as to decrease biliary tree flow. For the pancreas, there is decrease in insulin production, as well as increase in glucagon production. For the adrenal medulla, chromaffin cells release norepinephrine and epinephrine into the blood. For the kidneys and the ureters, there is decrease in urine production, as well as renin release for activation of your renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, as well as a decrease in ureter peristalsis. For your bladder, there is a decrease in detrusor muscle contraction, as well as contraction of your internal urethral sphincter. For the gonads or sex organs, for the male, there is ejaculation, and for the female, there is uterine contractions. Parasympathetic responses are for rest and digest activities, as well as for storage of energy. Next, we have specific parasympathetic responses. So for the eyes, it is miosis or constriction of the pupils, curving of the lens, and decreased in lacrimation or tearing up. For the other glands, like your lacrimal, nasal, and palatine glands, there is generally an increase in secretions. For your salivary glands, there is an increase in salivation, as well as an increase in salivary amylase, resulting in a more watery saliva. For the lungs, there is bronchoconstriction and an increase in secretions. For the heart, there is a decrease in heart rate as well as blood pressure. For the GIT, there is an increase in motility, peristalsis, secretions, as well as absorptions. For the pancreas, there is an increase in insulin resistance. For your liver, there is glycogenesis and an increase in biliary tree flow. For your kidneys, there is an increase in urine production, and for your ureters, there is an increase in ureter peristalsis. For your urinary bladder, there is detrusor muscle contraction, as well as relaxation of your internal urethral sphincter, allowing for voiding to happen. For your anus, there is also a relaxation of the internal anal sphincter, allowing for feces to pass out. For the gonads or sex organs, in the male, there is an erection, and for the female, there is a clitoris engorgement. Now let's proceed to autonomic reflexes. Autonomic reflexes are important in sensing internal stimuli as well as adjusting accordingly, automatically without you having to be conscious of it. Things like blood pressure and digestion are examples. The components of an autonomic reflex arc is comprised of a receptor, being an interoreceptor, a sensory neuron, an integrating center which usually is in the hypothalamus, a motor neuron, and an effector organ. Effector organs of the ANS reflex are usually smooth muscle and glands, as well as cardiac muscle. Now let's talk about autonomic control by higher brain centers. Major control of the ANS is from the hypothalamus. The posterior and lateral hypothalamus controls sympathetic responses, so stimulation of these areas produces sympathetic effects like increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increase in body temperature, dilation of pupils, as well as inhibition of the GIT. The anterior and medial hypothalamus, on the other hand, are for parasympathetic control of the ANS. Stimulation of these parts results in a decrease in heart rate, decrease in blood pressure, constriction of pupils, as well as an increase in secretion and motility or movement of the GIT. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.